The Critical Conversations Project convened a multidisciplinary group of experts who explored spiritual approaches to ethical, environmental, and transcendent issues and the built environment. We recognize that our most vexing problems are directly related to the built environment and that design professionals have the ability and responsibility to seek, design, and implement solutions. The first session, Justice and Participation, addressed spatial, economic, environmental, and professional injustices. The second, Environmental Adaptation and Ecotechnology, Climate Change, Globalization, and Urbanization. And the third, Transcendent Human Habitats, the Loss of Place, Cultural Identity, and Meaning. Each concluded with panelists sharing their ideas, solutions, and hopes for the future.
Today we're facing entwined crises of class, systemic racism, biodiversity loss, and climate breakdown. And so, the emphasis coming out of architecture on these issues has largely been focused on design solutions. And I would argue that actually architectural artifacts have very little to contribute to being able to solve these crises or to address them meaningfully. And this is because architecture reflects the society that creates it, and we are living within global capitalism. And so architecture has largely been sort of relegated to being a commodity, primarily for the elite, for people who can pay for it. And so within this context, architectural practice is not a benevolent calling. And to actually call it that without thinking that we need some sort of dramatic change is actually very destructive, because architecture has perpetuated and is perpetuating still a lot of harm.
The harms that architecture has been entangled with are not harms that are unique to architecture. Destruction of the environment, centering of whiteness, centering of male authority, centering of privileged classes. These are harms that are perpetuated by many professions, and many professions have been trying to rethink their relationship to these harms, to atone for them, and to, in fact, rethink the profession itself in light of greater participation and the centering of justice.
And so there are several turning points that the profession is facing. I think of them as 4 turning points. There's an ethical turn that is happening, where increasingly we're asking ethical questions about what are our responsibilities to the planet, to other people, to other species. There's an economic turn, which is that we're moving into a sharing economy, which has helped us understand the use of space very differently and more efficiently and effectively. There's what I think of as the epistemological turn, which is a greater demand for design thinking and our design methods to address issues beyond the design of buildings. And then there's the final one, which I think of as the experiential turn, which is that as a result of the pandemic, it's rebalanced the relationship of the digital and the physical world. And for the first time in human history, the physical world has a competitor, and people have a choice as to whether they do something remotely or in person. And so that forces us to think about the physical environment in terms of the experiences it can create that are different from what can be achieved online.
Ethics is a way of talking about the practices that really express the spiritualities, the practices that really express and then reinforce the claiming powers that we are wanting to choose for our professional practice. So for an ethical approach, we might think of the capacity of ourselves to achieve virtues through our professional practice. After all, part of what defines a profession is its capacity to be a public good. So what virtues help achieve and make good on that promise of the public goodness of the profession. So, to what do we aspire in our professions? How do we talk about not only what not to do and what to avoid, but what to fulfill?
And so we should be redesigning our profession, our practices, our educational system. It's interesting, we as a field take a lot of risks when it comes to designing buildings, but we are the most conservative profession of all when it comes to reimagining our practices. And it's the same with higher education. We still have educational models that go back a couple centuries. And so, to me, what is needed is an ongoing design process that reimagines these systems that are inequitable and unsustainable, and that involves the participation of everybody affected by it. In education, we have to be listening to our students. Where do they want to learn? How do they want to learn? What do they want to learn? And we need to work with them in that. And the same is true in communities. What kind of built space do they need? What don't they need? What don't they want? What are the harms that we're not aware of that they are aware of? And so to achieve a more just future, it needs the participation of everybody affected by our decisions. So I see an enormous opportunity for design in the future, because we're at a moment where almost everything needs to get redesigned. The systems that we have are not working anymore for anybody. And so that is our role, that's our opportunity, and that's our charge, I think.
What we really need to do in order for any form of architecture to have meaning is to change the way that it's produced. So I think that there are three main areas that we need to focus on, which you'll see are kind of encapsulate a lot. So it's how we practice, who is able to practice, and who our practice then serves. So we're really talking about a wholesale transformation of the way that we're operating.
This is about professional practice, such as public health or public interest law. Now, what does a profession mean? According to Dr. Howard Gardner at the Harvard School of Education, a profession means to profess a mission. So that returns to this idea of aspirations, because we need to be aspirational. We need to think big to address these big challenges. So the mission I use for public interest design is every person should be able to live in a socially, economically, and environmentally healthy community. That is ambitious, right? But that is the change we need to happen.
It seems like we're at a moment in history where people are looking for alternative ways of understanding our place in the world and the way forward. And certainly for me, working among Navajo students, I'm learning new concepts about the environment, new worldviews, and for me, I think it's often rooted in a very strong sense of community, of clan, of family, and I've often referred to my colleague Ted Hahola's pronouncements about the importance of the 7-generation model, where one can understand oneself in relation to the generations that come both before oneself as well as after, and that it positions the planner or the architect in a place of, I think, humility, where there's a set of limits and constraints, and where one is bound to the responsibility of something larger than oneself.
I think architects have always dreamed of having social impact. But traditionally that's been a top-down process. And top-down process of the architect coming up with a vision and implementing it, it's almost impossible for that to be meaningful or valuable. So you have to have the community involved in that type of visioning process. So it's no longer top-down, it's participatory, so that we can have ideas, visions verified, redirected by the communities they're for. So that's one reason things are different. So we're actually making a difference after being collaborative with the communities. The second reason is we're collecting evidence to show that we can do this. And so for the last 20 years, there have been really creative people out there in trenches, on the streets, coming up with ideas, coming up with methods, coming up with professional models or hybrids with schools and nonprofits and for-profits, and really just testing things out and really wanting to see results, not theories, not proposals, not visions, but actual projects. So we have 20 years now of evidence of those projects happening. So that's convincing. So documenting the best practices and sharing those is something that's different now.
When we begin to understand the world from the perspective of others, it helps us ask, well, what is it that we're about? What is architecture? What are the fundamentals that we need to provide? So ethics leads us to different aesthetic outcomes.
I think that in many ways it's an alternative to what one might call the wow factor in architecture, or Paul Valéry talked about it as the intoxication with the new that somehow drives forward concepts of cultural modernization. I think it's a worldview in which constraint and limits and humility are very much prevalent. One can learn from examples around the globe. And of course, in the American Southwest, there are exceptional models of that. The hogan is used for both ceremonial purposes, for ritual, but also for living. For me, it's very rich because the mythical meaning of the building extends or transcends beyond its functional purpose.
The good side of a building is actually it sort of is a physical manifestation of a bigger goal. Now, when I say bigger goal, I actually mean that the building itself is a small part of the contribution we can make. So Sergio Pallaroni says that 90% of the impact of his building goes beyond the physical building itself. So what does that mean? That means that in the design process, you're creating community, you're creating a sense of equity, people are involved in shaping their environment, you're empowering them. So these are things that it's in the process. It's in this participatory process. And through that, you can address things like systemic injustice or health inequality or discrimination. You can address these bigger issues that aren't really just about a building.
There's an increasing demand in the world, with all of its dysfunctional and inequitable systems, for design thinking, to think about possible futures that are different from the one that we have in front of us. And they're recognizing that design thinking and design methods are useful for things beyond the design of buildings. So increasingly, I think we're going to be asked to design strategies or systems. For example, we worked with a group of a community of people who were experiencing homelessness and the faith community to recognize that there's a federal law, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, that was on the books and underappreciated on the part of faith communities, that this actually enabled them to build extremely affordable housing on their land, even if it didn't meet zoning requirements. And so this was a way of using design as a strategy to leverage an existing law and reimagine its application to serve another kind of end. And so that is an example of how design can be a very effective strategic tool in helping us envision more equitable, just futures for ourselves.
There are many forms that arose in the 20th century of what we think of as engaged spirituality, where practitioners and curators of spiritual practices are working with communities to make sure that the spiritualities lead in the direction of social change, lead in the direction of the practice of justice and the expansion of participation and representation in the life of the community. So, for example, the movement called Engaged Buddhism, attributed to Thich Nhat Hanh in Vietnam. So it's a global movement to make spirituality effective in the social arena. Liberation theology is analogous. It takes Catholic spirituality and Catholic scripture and asks, what do the narratives of Jesus, what do the gospel stories have to say that would empower the community to make the change it needs regarding access to the goods of life from which it is presently being denied?
We don't have to start with a blank slate. Just take the idea of a nonprofit, for example. A nonprofit their mission is to serve the public. So a nonprofit architecture office is architecture that serves the public. Those are existing structures. And you can get funding from foundations, from donations once you're a nonprofit. There are other models where you can have hybrid, where you have a nonprofit and a for-profit architecture firm working together.
We really need to build power through, I think, unionization to start. By building solidarity and power within architecture, we are building a foundation to then be able to organize alongside others, other organized workforces, other grassroots movements. And through that expanded network of collective power that we're building, we can advocate for systemic change. So the Chicago Teachers Union is actually a great example of the sort of positive good that a union can do within a community. So they organize on the principles of bargaining for the common good. So as teachers, they understand that their work and their working conditions are completely entwined with the living conditions of their students. You know, you can start to imagine what a union of architects in Chicago could then do, right? So if you had a union of architects who joins in on this call for affordable housing and access to affordable housing, you know, between teachers and architects, we could pretty much shut the city down, right? And so, you know, in that way we can have some real wins at the local and the national level. And so we're building both a better, more equitable form of practice, but we're also building solidarity with communities, with the communities that we're working within, and gaining their trust and their support, and making them part of this sort of vision for what the built environment could be.
Architects bring something to the table, the creative talent, the sort of artistic side, but that is never enough. We need to affirm the architecture with the outside, with the stakeholders, with others.
I think listening to alternative voices is more important now than ever before. I'm learning about the incredible resources of tribal colleges, where people are very much embedded in the local and the issues that are confronting their communities, and what it means to be a leader within their tribal community, with the struggles of grappling with being part of the 21st century with all of its trauma and messiness, and yet remaining true to traditional culture and values.
So I think that we're at this moment where we're reimagining the architectural profession and reimagining something as fundamental as what do we do in built space. And I think that those are issues that have to affect architectural education, that we can't simply judge a student's work by their end design product, and we need to be asking, how are you thinking? How did you arrive at that design? Who did you talk to? And who didn't you talk to? And whose voice wasn't heard? What kind of harm are you doing with your design? Not only what are the benefits of your design.
We need to change the expectations that students have of coming out of school, what their work could look like, and what is expected of them and what they can expect. It is completely designed to benefit employers at the expense of workers who are forced to make, dramatic sacrifices in terms of their health, in terms of their relationships outside of work. And this leads many people, especially women and people of color, to ultimately leave practice. And so we end up with a design workforce that is missing a lot of voices. And if we're talking about envisioning new forms of practice and what the future of practice looks like, these are voices that we really need to be part of that conversation.
I think there's a really exciting opportunity here for interdisciplinary collaboration between architects and other disciplines, and for architects to do their own homework about understanding who has been invisibilized in the history of architectural practice. So part of that work is for architects to do themselves about processes and practices of invisibilization, and then thinking about reparation for that history through ongoing and future architectural practice. Other colleagues from other fields can help in that process. Theologians, historians, anthropologists, by studying the history of architecture, by interviewing present architects, by observing architectural practices, can help architects get a handle on their own practice. And for that, you can't just ask yourself what's going on. You need critical perspectives from other fields to give you a 360-degree view about what actually the practice is accomplishing as it undertakes its work.
I would say that for all designers, architects, landscape architects, urban designers, our approach to sustainability is what I would call limited so far, not nearly enough. And I would say that we need to reimagine our built environment in a really different way. Our buildings need to be givers, not takers. We need to have different kinds of relationships with all kinds of community groups to be able to realize a building that not only gets built but has a kind of long-term performance and adaptability that can respond to all kinds of changes and not be rigid but really flexible in our future.
Sustainability means a balance between environments and human dependence on those environments. So if you think of any relationship, any system, when there starts to be an imbalance, either physiologically or emotionally, it can't be sustained indefinitely. And I think that's where we are right now in our relationship with the earth.
Sustainable cities for me are places where we have rethought the relationship to nature. For many years in American cities, we've looked to either push nature and natural systems away and separate ourselves from them, or to kind of selectively bring different aspects in bits and pieces throughout the city, and perhaps then only for a selected few within that city. What needs to happen in the future, and what is happening in some cities now, is to create a city that integrates functional natural systems throughout the entire city and really thinks about the city not as a collection of buildings, but as a fabric rooted in the public realm. And for me, when I talk about the public realm, I include not only designed landscapes like plazas and parks and that sort of thing, but also infrastructure, streets, highways, waterfronts, industry, like actual ports and facilities that we need to keep the city running. Almost any space outside of the building walls counts as the public realm.
We need a change in our thinking about the impacts of human development on nature, and we need a regenerative practice, not one that retains the status quo. So I tend to stay away from terms like sustainability, which entrenches an established worldview, and use words like regenerative in order to open up new spaces for the design imagination.
We still seem to kind of rely on technology as the default kind of solution for achieving sustainability. And coming from my spiritual background or my theological background, I would suggest that, we need to kind of, not that technology isn't important, but we also need to be able to expand our empathetic horizon to kind of enable us to relinquish a more egocentric or anthropocentric kind of perspective to one that is earth-centered and ecocentric, that recognizes the Earth's needs as primary and those of the human as derivative. Because I think we continue to operate from the hubris that assumes we can have healthy humans on an unhealthy planet.
I would say that right now we're working with fairly traditional definitions of what is an architect, what is a landscape architect, what is an urban designer, and they tend to be always couched in terms of the relationship with the, quote, client. I think that's an old model that really needs to be rethought, because these kinds of nonprofits, advocacy groups, political groups, business improvement groups, design review committees need to be players within a kind of larger constellation.
We need diverse voices at the table in order to be able to chart a new path forward, because the way that we've been operating for decades hasn't really resulted in the kind of sustainability that we want.
Working with different actors in the design and development of cities, from architects to urban planners to landscape architects, really becomes a wonderful new kind of choreography that we can develop over time together and with various communities in order to get this a collaborative expression of the city, and multi-species one too.
So there is multidisciplinarity in looking at our environments, built and natural environments, and the fusion of the both in order to create not only greater sustainability, but greater perspectives for health, in one in which health is such a rare commodity, a full commodity in that sense of emotional, physical, and mental health. I mean, people who have all three are very lucky indeed these days.
I think challenging our mental models and perceptions will lead us to new ways of understanding what it is that we're designing and how we understand what sustainability is and what it means for the people who live in the places where we're designing.
We have designed several sacred spaces for really different religions: Judaism, Catholicism, Taoism, and First Nations gathering. And I would say the lessons we've learned from all of those groups is that they really want to be connected to nature. And this kind of direct relationship between places of worship and nature, being able to physically view the kind of awe and wonder of the world, really allows each of these such different faith groups to continually recontextualize what they do, why they do it together, in harmony with nature. So to observe these subtle shifts of steam and mist and weather changes, seasonal changes, as part of revisiting their liturgy every day, I just think is so meaningful and so important. So it's not something new or revelatory, but this kind of demand for this proximity, this kind of alignment. So you're almost bringing nature into your place of worship.
The design of St. Gabriel's is all about the horizontal. So the entire worship facility is oriented, instead of the vertical, towards an outdoor garden. So the sacred space of the interior actually extends out into the sacred space of the garden, which is sort of gives an opportunity for the building to serve as kind of a pedagogical opportunity to remind us that actually creation or the universe or the earth for humans is the primary revelatory experience of the divine. So, which is quite a different orientation than our traditional Christian worship.
So we worked with a remarkable group of Catholic women, and they asked us a really profound question. They asked us, how can we, in our building, describe what we value as a community, and how can it speak about that when we are no longer here? So I would say for me that goes way beyond just meeting so many rooms and a kitchen and dining hall. It actually is about a kind of a different level of investigation. And for us, we had to work really hard to both address their spiritual needs. Their chapel was very much the heart and soul of their project, but they also really demanded an environmental agenda. and they wanted the greenest building that they could afford.
Nature provides both direct and indirect health benefits in our cities. You can think of all the ecological benefits, and they start from the fact that the most fundamental and basic is that nature provides shade. Shade can make the difference of up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit in temperature differential, so that some people are affected by urban heat islands much more than others. And under a shade canopy, you're also more likely to conduct physical exercise or meet with other people, so that socialization also moves this whole health equation forward. On top of that, nature is shown, or street trees in particular, are shown to diminish violence in neighborhoods. And heat brings up levels of violence. So put those two things together. And so by depriving nature and residents, I should say neighborhoods and residents of nature contact, we are experiencing all of these detriments to health at much higher levels.
I think that, we need to be able to get beyond human exceptionalism as an a priori value, and really look at the way the universe has evolved over its 14.5 billion years of cosmogenesis, always moving towards greater diversity or differentiation, greater subjectivity or interiority, because the universe is not a collection of objects so much as it is a community of subjects. And because of those two, also always towards greater community and interconnectedness, sort of this web of life, if you will. So if we really take a moment as architects and instead of being busy with problem solving, kind of take a moment to be absolutely present with all of our senses, sort of expanding our empathetic horizon to really, really pay attention to the voices of the earth as a way of ensuring that we can bring about a more mutually enhancing human-earth relationship.
The story we missed was the story of Sergei Vinogradsky, who was identifying microbes in agriculture as being responsible for some of these mineral cycles, the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, sulfur cycles. And he really identified the importance of microbes as being the base of the biosphere and actually making the living world. And so by the turn of this century, we have a very negative view of microbes, although the molecular biology tools have shown us how amazing and extraordinary they are. They can transform our waste into stuff that we can use. They can make environments work in ways that we do not have the intelligence or the physical capability of doing. So an example would be the Living Architecture project, for which I was a coordinator. It's a European Union project that ran from 2016 to 2019. It was delivered successfully, and what we did was we created little cities of microbes, called them bioprocessors, and that we could feed them household waste, and they would transform that waste into useful things, like cleaned water. They can also produce bioelectricity, and they can produce it at a number of volts. We can imagine from our work with the Living Architecture project that 12-volt households based only on organic waste would be possible, and that would dramatically reduce our carbon footprint.
I think that the issue of sustainability needs to be thought of at multiple scales. For example, one project that's really part of the public realm is an overlooked system of back alleys, laneways in the city of Toronto. They've been there for a really long time and really not regarded highly, a lot of sort of unused garages and just not cared for. I think that over the last 20 years, through the efforts of architects, urban designers, nonprofit groups, and politicians, there's been a complete transformation. And so what we actually thought of was leftover and throwaway is actually now really beginning to be seen as a really valued public realm, as a place to address stormwater issues, greening issues, ways to have places to live and work and play, addressing affordability in housing. And so something that, had never been really considered to be really having any potential is now an untapped resource.
So in building on new processes and new ways of working, I think we can also start to ask ourselves, what is the impact of the work that we've done, and to really spend time thinking about and diving into the realities, quantifying what is the impact of public spaces that we've built. Do they actually manage stormwater in the way that we want them to? What is the impact of increased trees and greenways on the numbers of air pollutions and asthma levels? What are the ways that people are able to access our open spaces and receive the mental health benefits from being in nature and being in community with one another, seeing different people out living their lives, enjoying, making music, playing? What are the actual benefits of those things?
Nature returns us to a sense of humility. We cannot feel important before that sunset or before the canyon. But at the same time, in experiencing awe and wonder in the big things, we can also find it in the very small things of nature, the little patterns and the uniquenesses and the tiniest aspects of creation make us see, wow, there is just a hand out there that has an extraordinary and sometimes humorous imagination. And I can't help personally but experience that sense of awe. If we deprive people of that opportunity, think of how diminished we will be.
In order to make a regenerative transformation of the way we live, underpinning human development and embodied in architectural practice, is to change our perspectives. Change our perspectives about intelligence. It is not just humans that know things, other agencies, things that are not human, the elements of the world know things that we don't. And we need to pay attention to those intelligences and hear what they're saying to us so we may work better with them.
Well, the great epiphany for me was, recognizing that the universe from its very beginning has had a psycho-spiritual dimension in addition to its physical material dimension. I think it was Teilhard de Chardin who first identified, or at least, articulated that reality about the universe. So for me, as an architect, I truly believe that my creativity is completely influenced and dependent upon the diversity of creativity that declares itself within the natural world.
For me, a large part of thinking about cities and sustainability is to reframe the dominant thinking of what is the individual interaction versus what is the communal interaction. And I think that we really need to fundamentally transform, as a society, our approach to the built environment to one that prioritizes collective health of humans and of the open spaces of the earth itself, and to one that really understands how to live together in a healthy community. And for me, that is at its core a spiritual question. What is our relationship to each other and to the earth, and how do we play that out as design professionals and as members of society?
I think if each of us saw ourselves as a person depicted in a group portrait rather than a selfie, I think we would be much better off.
With that really comes a kind of humility in our design, in that we are co-authors, we are collaborators, and we are agents of nature, working with the substances of nature around us, and maybe through us, maybe channeled through our societies and cultures and desires. Maybe we can bring nature with us on the journey to help persuade nature that actually we're not the bad guys, that the ways of working and thinking are egalitarian, and invite nature into our spaces.
We need to act well, and we need to act quickly to really be able to make a difference in the kind of planet that we're on. And I think the sooner we can do that, the better.
I'm absolutely convinced that the universe and the earth, in our precipitous situation right now, is calling us to kind of reimagine our relationship, reestablish relationship, which for me means that we relinquish our exploitive relationship to the earth, understand and appreciate the intrinsic value of every living and non-living entity that we share this planet with. And actually, whether we're architects or lawyers or accountants or in the medical profession, that we accept the great challenge, to participate in the great work that will bring about this mutually enhancing relationship with the earth.
Transcendence in human habitats, for me, is more of a definition of transcendence through the experience of architecture. And I find that the experience of transcendence, coming from a place of emotion, coming from a place of feeling, is really one of being united with something that's either larger than oneself, or a larger community, or feeling a sense of awe, or feeling a sense of wonder.
To me, the transcendence is about the reciprocal relationship between ourselves and the world we live in. So there are no buildings, either physical objects or spaces, that are inherently transcendent. In other words, we need this person who is prepared to have transcendent experience in order to have this reciprocal relationship happen.
So it is through architecture that we can start to think about the transcendent. So what does that mean? It means that architecture can start to curate, set up, engender or prepare someone to feel the transcendent, to contemplate, whether as an individual or in group worship or contemplation. So I feel that architecture, or the built environment, the designed environment, can really set up for these opportunities, but is not in and of itself transcendent.
It's about creating habitats that facilitate humanity in transcending itself. A disconnect from matter, maybe even a disconnect from the measured world. Identifying maybe in the incompleteness of oneself, a place that completes ourselves.
Transcendent human habitats, or transcendent architecture, has to do with some sort of a creation of a liminal space. Someplace that is not yet, but it's already, and it calls us to be something that we can be. It calls us to meet ourselves, either coming or going. It's a transitional sort of a space, I think.
What are the aspects that are needed in your consciousness to design transcendent architecture? First, I believe that it's very important that you have a worldview. It helps if this worldview supports the theme that there is order in the universe, and that it behooves us to be in harmony with that order. I think next, in order to gain that sense of order, it helps to practice contemplation, compassion, and moderation, keeping in mind that you are only a very small part of this universe.
Transcend, meaning transcend, going across, going beyond. What is it that we go beyond? I think there are two things. I think there is a mainstay value systems that we tend to take for granted as valued system or trustworthy system that we use easily and readily. For example, the modern sciences we rely on, or capitalism, or positivism. The second one is transcending one's immediate self. So one's own interest, one's own purposes, or one's own benefits. Those are the things that I think of going beyond when I think of transcendental experiences.
There is always a question, you're saying that these experiences happen, these situations happen. Do they really happen? Is this just subjective? Of course, there is plenty of word of mouth through human history that say, well, if you just go to Chartres Cathedral, or if you go to the Pantheon, or you go to the Great Pyramids, something unique happens. And there is plenty of validation to that. You have these surveys, but of course, these days, we don't assign great value to these surveys or these experiences because there is not some sort of evidence, scientific, empirical evidence. So one way in which I think in the last 30, 40 years have become available is the power of neuroscience and neurology and physiology to be able to begin to measure conditions of our responses to environments of this type that indicate that these experiences, first, they're not purely subjective. The combination of neuroscience and phenomenology open incredible doors to begin to understand for first time in history of how these buildings are able to quicken this connection to something larger than ourselves.
We're living in times with many struggles, right? Climate change, issues of inequity, presently a pandemic, a war. We're searching for ourselves, the nature of ourselves. How are we significant? How do we live purposeful lives? What is the meaning of our lives? How do we find within ourselves a selflessness? How do we think more about community and the various ways we can contribute as maybe humanitarians, maybe as architects thinking more about our role as humanitarians and how that may result in a transcendent space as an architect?
I think there's a real need for that kind of a transcendent architecture, that habitat, right now, because, especially at the end of this pandemic season, people don't know if they're coming or going, and they are living in the midst of a liminal space. And having architecture that speaks directly to that experience helps us to find ourselves again. It invites us to have an experience that we might not have otherwise. Because at that moment of the liminal space, it slows down the passage of time so that we have a moment to reflect.
I think when we take a look around the world today, we can see a culture that's deeply divided. We can see ourselves falling on different lines that are political, that are entrenched. And I think transcendent spaces in the built environment can really help us overcome that, the experience of being in these transcendent spaces, because what that does for me is create this sense of being borderless, whether that's in feeling, whether that's in community. And I think this kind of thinking of being borderless, of being multidisciplinary, of being able to understand something outside ourselves, this is incredibly, urgently needed today.
Transcendent architecture very much believes that culture is the key to how you go about building what is at the root of human beings and also the diversity of human beings. You have to recognize that, but not to be used politically, but to be used as a very important aspect to create identity and social identity.
There are age-old examples I can think of, like Sultan Hassan Madrasa in Cairo, right? And you think about how that sets you up for a transcendent experience. It's not in and of itself transcendent, right? So you enter, you remove your shoes, you rise up a set of stairs, you enter a door, and in that door you are led into a dark tunnel, narrow and tall, with no light except for an opening at every 90 degrees where you are literally turning your body. And then once you're done, 3 turns, right? And you arrive at this bright, open courtyard with a water fountain, and all you can hear are the sounds of birds and water and light. And what's overwhelming is through that passage and these 3-meter thick walls, you have become separated from the noise and the crowds of Cairo to a serene space that does nothing short of take your breath away. Whether you are there to worship or not, that is a transcendent experience.
There are many cases in which there are buildings, for instance, that certainly could be considered, should be considered transcendent built environment that allows us to, again, enter in an aesthetic state of connection to something larger than ourselves, advances an ethical doing the good, or advances our culture. For example, I always think of the Salk Institute by Louis Kahn in La Jolla, California, as a great example of an aesthetic experience, a very powerful building that on top of that produces remarkable contribution to our society, our civilization, because of course it's a place of scientific research, but the place itself is quite powerful aesthetically.
So, for example, I currently have a sculpture that's in the Smithsonian where I ask people to give me a word for their future. And using artificial intelligence and machine learning, the sculpture reinterprets a very specific light mandala for each person's expression of their own vision of their future. And there's a central piece of the sculpture that puts all of our visions of the future together. And it's been amazing to watch people interact with that, to feel their own sense of individual agency, to see their collective responsibility in envisioning their futures together.
One of the ways that transcendent architecture can facilitate our growth is this notion of space in relation to speed. And it has the ability to slow us down a little bit so that we can notice that as we're living our lives forward, there's also a history that we need to take into account. And it calls us to look both forward and backward simultaneously and gives us some sort of permission, if you will, to pause and do exactly that. And so in the midst of this permission-granting kind of architecture, it doesn't have to be something that's exceptionally large or exceptionally grand or call attention to itself so much as it invites us to bring attention to ourselves and our surroundings and the other people who inhabit it with us.
So I want to give some examples of buildings that I have been in that I felt the experience of transcendence. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London. On the western wall of that building complex are some scars in the exterior of the building material. Those scars were made by the bombs that were dropped by Germans during the Second World War. They left those scars unrepaired. And there was a text that was carved into that explains why this scar was made. And at that time, I realized that this, scarred building, not a very perfect building, gave me an opportunity to think about the time of the war, how people may have suffered, and how people found an opportunity to take this, imperfection of the building, turn it into a commemoration, and make it something meaningful to themselves and to the future.
We can apply an expanded agency of the design profession by understanding what the transcendent can be in different building typologies, but also understanding that buildings that traditionally were places of worship have now become places for much more activation of what the transcendent is, individually and as a group, but also as places for community gathering and community activities that embody some of the ideals of the group. An example of this would be diaspora communities. I studied mosques constructed across Canada. I visited 90 mosques in 53 different cities across the country. And what I saw in these places weren't just places of worship, and I didn't just examine how they looked and what they were. I looked at the stories, and what I saw were communities creating spaces for charity, for gathering, for giving, for doing, so much more, and that architecture needs to become flexible to allow for the range of these activities and to perpetuate, constantly renewing itself and becoming much more catalytic spaces.
Transcendent human habitats and architecture requires a courageous, active revolt against the dominant material determinism that controls most of human life today in this world. To counter that, I think that transcendent architecture supports a balanced point between rational and metaphysical interpretation of existence.
Quite often in our process, we will develop a set of schematic or design development drawings that are of the normal commercialized systems. But then we might approach it differently and say, look, if we think more in terms of sculpting space as an artisan, about maybe instead of a rain screen, metal stud infill, a tube steel structure, or WF section, maybe in terms of a 2-inch steel plate, thinking in terms of a Richard Serra sculptural piece. Maybe that steel plate can serve structure, waterproofing, and finished materiality. And we did just that. And we had the contractor price both, and the client's money went to materiality and systems as opposed to a long duration of general conditions and overhead. And it resulted in a significantly better building, a building that will last longer, a building that responds to the natural elements of place, will age in patina beautifully, will move from a world of artificial to more of a world of artificial/natural world. And it's that place for us where mystery begins to occur, because occupants of the building, visitors to the place, don't quite quickly understand what exactly was constructed or how it was constructed or the process of constructed, because it's out of the realm of ordinary. And so it takes them to a different place.
I think as architects, we have given up some of our agency. I think we have become somewhat enslaved to the forces of capital, and we need to reclaim our place as the poets of culture. And architecture is not just a container, it's a catalyst of culture. And this needs to be something we're boldly stating to the people who commission work from us, so that they are then empowered to expect something better from us. And we, as multidisciplinary natural collaborators who work with engineers and contractors and scientists and all kinds of fields, we have the natural capability to really build this kind of holistic vision for ourselves, our futures. And I definitely think that we need to be much more vocal about reclaiming our place in society that way.
When confronted the hard problems of the world today, all these things that I mentioned earlier, one of the natural responses is to feel depressed, cynical, discouraged, fearful, all natural responses, but nonetheless disempowering and not encouraging ones to engage the world. I think it's very important that we see the world, the future of the world, in a very positive and optimistic way. Not out of naivete, but the opposite. I think it's important to see that this world has great potential, and that youth and anybody today has not just the opportunity, but also the great honor to move forward. A view of the future is one that should be of great positive outlook. I think the best days of the world are yet to come, and this transcendent built environment idea will allow us to move in that direction and resolve many of these challenges that we otherwise face.